Little girl walks into a police station and asks to sleep there. The officer asks why, and she says, "His third leg is too big." The officers call 911 in tears. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Rain pounded against the windows of Pine Creek Police Station as midnight ticked by on a Tuesday in October. The small Alabama town had long since gone to sleep, leaving only 3 officers to man the quiet station. Jackson with his crossword puzzle, Thompson scrolling through fishing photos, and Miller nursing his third cup of coffee. The sudden knock at the door startled all 3 men. Who'd be out in this storm? Thompson wondered, setting his phone aside. Officer Miller opened the door to find a small figure standing alone in the downpour. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, soaked to the bone, her blonde hair plastered to her pale face. She wore mismatched pajamas and rain boots too large for her tiny feet. "Good heavens!" Miller gasped, immediately ushering her inside. "What are you doing out here all alone, sweetheart?" The child didn't answer. Her eyes, wide and haunted, darted between the 3 officers as water pooled beneath her feet on the linoleum floor. Officer Thompson quickly grabbed a blanket from the station's emergency kit, while Jackson picked up the phone. "I'll call social services," he said, his voice hushed. Miller knelt before the girl, wrapping the blanket around her. Trembling shoulders. "I'm Officer Miller. Can you tell me your name?" "Ellie," she whispered, barely audible above the storm. "Ellie Dalton." "Ellie," Miller repeated gently. "That's a pretty name. Can you tell me where you live? Where are your parents?" The little girl's lips quivered. "I live with Frank and Grandma Mildred, out past Wilson Creek Road." The officers exchanged glances. They knew the area. Remote houses scattered along the rural route, some without proper heating or plumbing. Not many children out there. "Frank is your dad?" Thompson asked, returning with a mug of hot chocolate. Ellie shook her head. "My stepdad. Mom's gone away." She accepted the mug but didn't drink, just held it tight as if absorbing its warmth. "And why aren't you home in bed, Ellie?" Miller continued softly. "It's very late, and storming something terrible." That's when the little girl's face crumpled. A single tear traced down her cheek as she whispered, "The third leg is too big. It makes scary noises when it breaks." The station fell silent. The 3 officers, all fathers themselves, exchanged dark glances. Miller felt his stomach tighten as Jackson slowly put down the phone receiver. "What do you mean by that, sweetheart?" Miller asked, keeping his voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. But Ellie had retreated into silence, her small hands clutching the mug as her eyes fixed on the floor. The lights flickered as thunder cracked overhead, momentarily casting the room in shadow. "I need help," she finally whispered. "Grandma won't wake up proper and I didn't know what to do when it broke again." Jackson resumed his call, speaking in urgent, hushed tones, while Thompson disappeared into the back room to prepare the station's small cot. As Miller helped Ellie to the chair by his desk, he noticed her limping slightly. "Are you hurt, Ellie?" She shook her head. "Just tired. Walked a long time to find help." The storm raged on outside as Ellie's eyes began to droop. Miller covered her with another blanket as she curled up in the chair that seemed far too big for her small frame. "You're safe now," he promised, though his mind raced with questions and concerns. As she drifted to sleep, the officers gathered in the hallway, their faces grim. "What exactly did she mean about a third leg?" Thompson whispered. Miller shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but I think we've got a serious situation on our hands, and someone named Frank has a lot of explaining to do." Outside, the wind howled through the trees of Pine Creek, carrying whispers that would soon grow into a storm of their own, one that would uncover secrets long hidden in the shadows of their small Alabama town. Dawn arrived with the storm's retreat, painting the sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold that belied the tension inside Pine Creek Police Station. Ellie still slept in the chair, her small chest rising and falling beneath the blanket, one hand clutching a tattered stuffed rabbit that Officer Thompson had found in her boot. The station door opened at precisely 7:30 a.m., admitting Claire Bennett from Child Protective Services. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, dark circles under her eyes, suggesting this emergency call was just one more burden on an already overwhelming caseload. "Where's the child?" she asked, her voice professional but weary. Miller led her to his desk where Ellie slept. Something in Claire's expression softened as she took in the little girl's fragile form. "Has she said anything else?" Claire whispered, setting her worn leather bag on the desk. "Nothing after that comment about the third leg," Miller replied. "She walked all the way from Wilson Creek Road in the storm." Claire's eyebrows rose. "That's nearly 3 miles. The conversation roused Ellie from sleep. Her blue eyes flickered open, immediately alert and wary as they settled on the unfamiliar woman. "Hello, Ellie, I'm Claire," she said, crouching to the child's eye level. "I'm here to help you." Ellie clutched her rabbit tighter. "Are you taking me home?" Claire's smile remained gentle. "Not just yet. First, we need to talk a little. Would that be okay?" Officer Jackson approached with a paper bag. "Brought some breakfast from Maggie's diner. Thought the little one might be hungry." Ellie's eyes widened at the sight of the warm cinnamon roll, but she didn't reach for it until Claire nodded encouragingly. "While you eat, can you tell me about your home, Ellie?" Claire asked, opening a notebook. "Who lives with you?" Between careful bites, Ellie answered, "Just me and Frank and Grandma Mildred. Mom went away." "When did your mom leave?" Ellie's brow furrowed in concentration. "After my birthday with the yellow cake. I'm 6 now." Claire made a note. "So about 2 years ago. And Frank is your stepfather?" Ellie nodded. "He takes care of us, but Grandma forgets things a lot." "What kinds of things does she forget?" "Sometimes she forgets to eat. Sometimes she calls me Carol, but that's Mom's name." Ellie's voice dropped to a whisper. "Sometimes she forgets Frank isn't a stranger and gets scared." Claire's pen paused. "That must be hard for everyone." Ellie shrugged with the simple acceptance of a child who knows no other reality. "Frank says Grandma's memories are like stars. Sometimes they hide behind clouds, but they're still there." While Claire continued her gentle questioning, Officers Thompson and Jackson prepared to visit Ellie's home. "We need to find this Frank," Jackson muttered, checking his weapon. "And check on the grandmother." "Easy," Miller cautioned. "We don't know what we're walking into." Meanwhile, Claire had given Ellie some crayons and paper. The child drew with the focused intensity only the very young can muster. A small house, 3 stick figures, and what appeared to be a larger figure with an odd third appendage. "Can you tell me about your drawing?" Claire asked carefully. Ellie pointed. "That's our house. That's me, that's Grandma in her chair, and that's Frank." Claire nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "And what's this part here?" Ellie's finger hovered over the strange third leg on the Frank figure. "That's his helper. It makes scary noises sometimes." Before Claire could probe further, the station phone rang. It was Thompson calling from Ellie's home. "Claire needs to hear this," he said, his voice tense. "The house is—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully with a child present. "It's in bad shape. No sign of Frank. The grandmother is here. Confused but physically okay." Claire took the phone, listening as Thompson described a house with minimal food, heat provided only by a wood stove, and prescriptions lined up on the kitchen counter. Some filled, others with notes reading, "No ride," or "Insurance denied." What struck Thompson most was the calendar hanging in the kitchen, doctor appointments scheduled for Ellie, most crossed out with similar notes, and on the refrigerator, a child's drawing almost identical to what Ellie was creating now. "And Frank?" Claire asked. "No sign of him," Thompson replied grimly. "Neighbors haven't seen him since yesterday afternoon." Claire looked at Ellie, quietly coloring another picture. The mystery of what happened in that house, and what the third leg truly meant, had only deepened like the shadows stretching across Pine Creek as whispers about the missing stepfather began to spread. By noon, the news of Ellie Dalton's mysterious appearance at the police station had spread through Pine Creek faster than spring pollen. The town square buzzed with speculation as neighbors gathered outside Josie's cafe, their coffee cooling in their hands as they traded theories. "I always said there was something off about that Frank Dalton," declared Dorothy Williams, her voice carrying across the patio. As head of the town council, Dorothy considered herself Pine Creek's unofficial guardian, living out there like hermits, never bringing the child to town events. "Now, Dorothy," Mr. Grady from the hardware store interjected, "the man's a veteran, served 2 tours overseas, might just prefer his privacy." Dorothy waved away his comment. "Privacy is one thing, secrecy is another. When was the last time any of us actually spoke to the man, or saw that poor grandmother out and about?" No one could recall, and that silence spoke volumes. Meanwhile, Sheriff Reynolds had organized a search for Frank Dalton, focusing on the woods surrounding the property. Officer Miller joined the volunteers, his military experience giving him insight into where a fellow veteran might seek shelter. As they combed through the dense Alabama forest, Miller found himself thinking about the few times he'd encountered Frank around town. Always polite, always distant. Standing in line at the pharmacy once, Frank had been waiting for prescriptions, his military posture unmistakable despite his obvious discomfort. The pharmacist had announced a delay, and Frank had simply nodded and moved to a corner chair, invisible to everyone who passed. What kind of man just disappears when his child needs him? One volunteer wondered aloud, breaking into Miller's thoughts. Maybe the kind who knows he's in trouble, another replied. Miller kept these observations to himself as they continued searching, the autumn leaves crunching beneath their boots. The forest grew denser as they approached the old hunting cabins, abandoned years ago when the lumber company bought the land. "Let's check these structures," Miller suggested, gesturing toward the dilapidated cabins. As the team spread out, Miller approached the smallest cabin, its roof partially collapsed. He would have passed it entirely if not for the faint sound from within. A cough, quickly stifled. Drawing his flashlight, Miller pushed open the warped door. The beam cut through dust motes dancing in the air, illuminating a figure huddled in the corner. Frank Dalton looked nothing like a man running from guilt. His face was gaunt, his clothes soaked from the previous night's rain. But it was his eyes that struck Miller, not the eyes. Someone hiding, but of someone who had been invisible for so long he'd forgotten how to be seen. "Officer Miller," Frank said, his voice hoarse. "Is Ellie safe?" Miller nodded slowly, entering the cabin but keeping his distance. "She showed up at the station last night. She's being looked after." Relief washed over Frank's face. "Thank God. When I woke up and found her gone." His voice broke. "I've been searching everywhere." Miller studied the man. "You've been searching? Seems like you're the one hiding out here." Frank attempted to stand, a grimace crossing his face as he shifted his weight. "Not hiding. Resting." He gestured to his right leg. "Can't move as fast as I used to. Needed to catch my breath before continuing the search." For the first time, Miller noticed how Frank kept his weight off his right leg, how it seemed slightly different in shape beneath his worn jeans. "We need to talk about Ellie," Miller said carefully. "About what she told us, about the third leg." Frank's expression transformed, not to guilt or anger, but to confusion. "Third leg? What are you talking about?" Before Miller could respond, shouts echoed through the trees as the other searchers converged on the cabin. Frank stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to his right thigh. "Please," he said quietly. "Whatever you think happened, whatever Ellie said, I need to explain. She's all I have left." As the other officers entered the small space, Frank's words were drowned out. "Sheriff." Reynolds read him his rights, though no formal charges had been filed. Frank didn't resist as they escorted him from the cabin, but his eyes found Miller's one last time. "She gets scared of the noise," he said cryptically. "It's not what you think." Back in town, Ellie sat in Claire's office, carefully arranging colored pencils by shade. On her paper, she'd drawn another figure with 3 legs, but this time with rain falling around it and what looked like lightning striking the extra limb. "What's happening in this picture, Ellie?" Claire asked. Ellie's small finger traced the lightning. "Bolt. This is when it broke. It made a sound like thunder. That's when I got scared." As Claire studied the drawing, her phone buzzed with a message from Officer Miller. "Found Frank. Coming in. Says there's an explanation." Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pine Creek, where Dorothy Williams was already gathering concerned parents for an emergency community meeting. The evening gathering at Josie's Cafe had transformed from the usual Thursday night dinner crowd into something more purposeful. Dorothy Williams stood by the counter, her voice carrying over the murmur of concerned parents and neighbors. "I've spoken with Mayor Harris," she announced, "and he agrees we need to address this situation with the Dalton child." She adjusted her reading glasses importantly. "We cannot have our community endangered by what exactly, Dorothy?" The interruption came from Earl Grady, the hardware store owner who rarely spoke at such gatherings. "By a man who hasn't even been charged with anything?" Dorothy's smile tightened. "I'm simply saying that where there's smoke, there's usually fire. That child showed up alone in a rainstorm with a very troubling story." The bell above the cafe door jingled as Officer Miller entered. Conversations hushed as he made his way to the counter, ordered a black coffee, and turned to face the impromptu assembly. "Evening, folks," he said calmly. "Notice quite a gathering here." Dorothy straightened. "We're discussing community safety, Officer Miller. In light of recent events." Miller nodded, sipping his coffee. "Interesting. I wasn't aware the details of an ongoing investigation involving a minor were public knowledge." An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. "We're just concerned citizens," someone offered from the back. "Concern is admirable," Miller replied. "Jumping to conclusions isn't, especially when a child and family's welfare is at stake." As the uncomfortable meeting continued, Claire Bennett was across town at Shady Pines Assisted Living, where Mildred Dalton had been temporarily placed. The elderly woman's silver hair was neatly combed, but her eyes held the cloudy confusion of advancing dementia. "Mrs. Dalton," Claire said gently, "I'd like to talk about Ellie and Frank." Mildred's gaze wandered around the unfamiliar room. "Is Carol coming today? She promised to bring those cookies I like." Claire made a note. "Carol is Ellie's mother, your daughter. When did you last see her?" The question seemed to momentarily pierce the fog. Mildred's eyes sharpened. "Carol doesn't come anymore, not since the night of the suitcases." "Suitcases?" Claire prompted. "Heavy with clothes, light with goodbyes," Mildred murmured, a moment of poetic clarity. She couldn't bear the weight anymore. "The weight of what, Mrs. Dalton?" Mildred's focus drifted again. "We became ghosts in this town long before Carol left." Then, with startling directness, she added, "Have you met Frank? He fixes things that break." "Yes, I've met Frank," Claire replied. "Ellie mentioned something about a third leg that makes noise. Do you know what she meant?" The elderly woman chuckled suddenly. "Oh, that old thing. Makes a racket, something terrible in the rain." Her expression clouded. "But he needs it. Ever since the war took part of him away." Before Claire could probe further, Mildred slipped back into confusion, asking if it was time for her program on the television. Meanwhile, Ellie had been placed with the Fosters, a temporary care family who had taken in many children over the years. Mrs. Foster watched with concern as Ellie picked at her dinner, eyes constantly darting to the windows. "You're safe here, sweetheart," Mrs. Foster assured her. Ellie nodded politely. "Thank you, ma'am." Her manners were impeccable, almost rehearsed. "Is it okay if I save some of this for later?" Mrs. Foster noticed how Ellie was carefully wrapping half her roll in a napkin. "There's plenty of food here, Ellie. You don't need to save it." "But what about tomorrow?" Ellie asked, genuine confusion in her voice. The question broke Mrs. Foster's heart a little. At the sheriff's station, Frank Dalton sat stiffly in the interview room. Officer Jackson, who had lost his own father to alcoholism and abuse, led the questioning with barely concealed hostility. So you're telling me you have no idea why your 6-year-old stepdaughter would run away in a thunderstorm? Jackson pressed. Frank's hands trembled slightly on the table. I told you I fell asleep after getting Mildred to bed. It takes hours sometimes. When I woke up, Ellie was gone. I thought maybe she'd gone to the neighbors. His voice cracked. I searched everywhere. And this third leg she keeps mentioning, the one that makes scary noises when it breaks? A complex emotion crossed Frank's face. Part realization, part relief, part fresh pain. She meant... He stopped, closing his eyes briefly. May I please speak with Ellie? I need to make sure she's all right. That's not happening, Jackson replied flatly. Outside the interview room, Miller observed through the one-way glass, remembering his own return from overseas, how even supportive families couldn't truly understand what veterans brought back with them. Something about Frank's demeanor didn't match Jackson's interpretation, but Miller kept his thoughts to himself. Across town, Claire discovered a folder of denied assistance applications in county records, all submitted by Frank over the past year, systematically rejected by her supervisor, Ronald Perkins, who had scrawled low priority across the latest one. As night fell over Pine Creek, the whispers had become stones, heavy with judgment and ready to be cast. But in the darkness, no one could yet see the full shape of the truth they were circling. Morning light filtered through the blinds of Sheriff Reynolds's office as he reviewed the situation with Officer Miller and Claire Bennett. After 24 hours of questioning, they had no actual charges to file against Frank Dalton. We can hold him another day for questioning, but that's it, the sheriff concluded, rubbing his temples. Without something concrete, a knock interrupted them. Deputy Thompson entered, looking concerned. Sir, Mr. Dalton's asking to be released. Says he needs to check on his home and get his medication. Medication? Claire asked, looking up from her notes. Says he has prescriptions he needs to take daily, for pain management. Claire exchanged glances with Miller. This aligned with what they'd found at the house. Rows of prescription bottles, some empty, others partially filled. Let's bring him in here, Sheriff Reynolds decided. When Frank entered, his appearance was jarring even to those prepared to dislike him. After a night without sleep, his gaunt face seemed hollowed out, dark. Circles beneath his eyes. Despite his exhaustion, he maintained a military posture that couldn't quite hide his discomfort. Mr. Dalton, Sheriff Reynolds began, we're trying to understand what happened the night Ellie came to the station. Frank's hands trembled slightly on the table, not from fear, Claire realized, but from restraint, like someone accustomed to hiding pain. I've told you everything, Frank said, his voice hoarse. I fell asleep. When I woke up, she was gone. I searched everywhere I could. On foot? In that storm? Miller asked. I don't have a car, Frank replied. Simply. Hasn't worked in months. Tell us about Ellie's statement, Claire said gently. About the third leg that makes scary noises. Something shifted in Frank's expression. A complex emotion somewhere between realization and dread. She meant... He stopped, swallowing hard. May I please see her? I need to make sure she's all right. That's not possible right now, Claire said. She's in temporary foster care until we sort this out. Frank's military composure cracked slightly. She gets scared easily, doesn't like new places. She was scared enough to walk 3 miles in a thunderstorm, Sheriff Reynolds pointed out. Frank's shoulders slumped slightly. We manage fine, he insisted, though his trembling hands betrayed him. We don't need charity. The word charity hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Claire recognized the pride of someone who'd rather suffer than ask for help. Mr. Dalton, she said carefully, there's no shame in accepting assistance when... Is Mildred being cared for? Frank interrupted. She needs her medication on schedule, or she gets more confused. She's at Shady Pines for now, Claire assured him. But I'd like to talk about Carol. Ellie's mother. When exactly did she leave? The question visibly stiffened Frank. She made her choice, he said flatly. Almost 2 years ago. Left us all behind. Before Claire could press further, the door opened and Officer Thompson returned with urgent news. The Fosters just called. Ellie's running a high fever. They're taking her to the hospital. Frank stood immediately, wincing as he put weight on his right leg. What's wrong with her? Is it her kidneys again? Again? Claire echoed, the word hanging between them like a revelation. The pediatric wing of Pine Creek Memorial Hospital was painted in cheerful yellows and blues, a stark contrast to the worry etched on Mrs. Foster's face as she paced the waiting room. When Claire arrived, the foster mother immediately approached. She was fine at bedtime, Mrs. Foster explained, twisting her wedding ring anxiously. But around midnight, she started crying about pain in her side. Her temperature shot up to 103. Dr. Abernathy, a silver-haired physician who delivered half the town's children, emerged from Ellie's room looking concerned. Miss Bennett, he acknowledged Claire. Ellie's presenting with symptoms consistent with a urinary tract infection possibly affecting her kidneys. We're running tests, but I'm particularly concerned this might be recurring. Frank Dalton mentioned something about her kidneys, Claire admitted. Is she awake? Can I speak with her? Inside the room, Ellie looked impossibly small. Against the white hospital sheets, her blonde hair stuck to her forehead with sweat, but her eyes brightened slightly at Claire's familiar face. "Hi, Miss Claire," she whispered. Claire sat beside the bed. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "It hurts again," Ellie said simply. "Like before." "You've had this pain before?" Claire asked gently. Ellie nodded. "Frank took me to the doctor, but they said we needed a different doctor, the special kind." Her small brow furrowed. "But it was too far away and the car broke." As they talked, Claire noticed a drawing on Ellie's bedside table. Another figure with 3 legs, this time with rain falling on it. Claire picked it up. "Can you tell me about this picture?" Ellie's finger traced the 3rd leg on the figure. "That's Frank's helper. It got wet in the rain and made the scary noise. Then it broke." "His helper?" "For walking," Ellie explained, as if it were obvious. "It helps him stand up straight." A gentle knock interrupted them as Margaret Miller entered the room. Officer Miller's wife was a retired school counselor, known for her way with children. "Claire, I heard about Ellie. I thought I might help," Margaret offered. "I brought some art supplies." Claire introduced them, grateful for Margaret's expertise. While Margaret settled in with Ellie and her crayons, Claire stepped into the hallway to call Sheriff Reynolds. "Ellie's drawing pictures of someone with a walking aid," she reported. "She calls it Frank's helper for walking. And she mentioned previous kidney problems that weren't properly treated." Meanwhile, across town, Frank had been released pending further investigation. Officer Miller drove him to his property, observing how the man winced with every pothole they hit. "Mind if I ask about your service?" Miller ventured. "I did 2 tours in Iraq myself." Frank's gaze remained on the passing countryside. "Afghanistan, Special Forces, 2 tours. Rough terrain out there." Frank nodded once, offering nothing more. When they arrived at the small house, Frank's military stoicism briefly cracked at the sight of the empty driveway. "Ellie usually waits by the window," he murmured, almost to himself. Inside, the house told a story that contradicted the town's whispers. Despite its disrepair, every surface was clean. Ellie's schoolwork hung on the refrigerator, each paper marked with careful comments in adult handwriting. Medication for Mildred was organized with military precision. Frank moved directly to a loose floorboard in the living room, prying it up to reveal a small cache. Medication bottles, a folded American flag, and a child's drawing labeled "My Family" showing 3 stick figures holding hands. "Mr. Dalton," Miller began cautiously. "Ellie mentioned something about a 3rd leg that makes noise when it breaks. Can you explain what that means?" Frank stared at the items in the hiding place for a long moment before meeting Miller's gaze. "It's not what everyone thinks," he said quietly. "It's just not what anyone wants to see." From the kitchen window, a neighbor watched their interaction, phone in hand, already dialing Dorothy Williams instead of coming over to help. At the hospital, as Ellie drifted to sleep, the doctor pulled Claire aside with concern. In his eyes, "Miss Bennett, these test results are troubling. Ellie's kidney function shows signs of chronic issues, problems that should have been addressed months ago." The afternoon sun slanted through the hospital windows as Margaret Miller spread an array of colorful crayons across Ellie's tray. Table. The child's fever had subsided with medication, bringing a touch of color back to her pale cheeks. "I used to help children tell their stories through art," Margaret explained, her voice warm as she selected a fresh sheet of paper. "Sometimes pictures can say things that are hard to put into words." Ellie nodded solemnly, studying the crayons with careful deliberation before selecting a brown one. "Frank says art is important because it shows what's inside you." Margaret watched as Ellie began to draw with the focused concentration only children possess. "You and Frank do art together?" "Sometimes," Ellie replied, adding a blue square to her paper. "When his hands don't shake too much, he taught me how to draw houses with proper porches." Outside in the hallway, Claire sat reviewing Frank Dalton's military records, which Officer Miller had helped her obtain. The file painted a picture starkly different from the suspicious recluse the town had imagined. Sergeant Frank Dalton, decorated twice for bravery, injured during his second tour in Afghanistan. Honorable discharge following recovery from combat injuries. Claire's phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor, Ronald. "Perkins. Need you back at the office. Dalton case creating unwanted attention." She frowned at the message before turning back to the military file. The medical section noted, "Significant damage to right femur and knee requiring surgical intervention," but the final pages indicated Frank had declined extended rehabilitation at the VA facility. Claire's thoughts were interrupted by Dr. Abernathy approaching with Ellie's test results. "It's as I suspected," he said gravely. "Ellie has a serious kidney infection that's likely been developing for some time. The concerning part is this: shouldn't have progressed this far with proper medical attention." "Frank mentioned previous kidney issues," Claire replied. "Said something about needing a specialist?" Dr. Abernathy nodded. "She would need a pediatric nephrologist. The nearest one is in Birmingham, about 2 hours from here." "What happens if a condition like this goes untreated?" The doctor's expression grew somber. "Recurring infections can cause permanent damage. In severe cases." He let the sentence hang unfinished. Back in Ellie's room, the drawing was taking shape. A house, a woman in a wheelchair by a window, a small figure that was clearly Ellie, and a taller figure with what appeared to be a stick extending from one leg. "Can you tell me about your picture?" Margaret asked gently. "That's our house," Ellie explained, pointing with a small finger. "That's Grandma Mildred by the window 'cause she likes to watch. The birds, that's me. And that's Frank with his helper stick." Margaret nodded encouragingly. "His helper stick?" "For walking," Ellie said matter-of-factly. "His leg got hurt in the war, so sometimes he needs his helper. But it's not very good. It breaks a lot." Margaret watched as Ellie added rain to the picture, dark blue streaks falling from a heavy cloud. "Is this about the night you came to the police station?" Ellie nodded, her crayon moving more slowly now. "It was raining really hard. Frank's helper broke again, and he fell down." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He made a noise like he was really hurt. I got scared." "What did you do then, Ellie?" "I tried to help him up, but he's too big. He told me to go next door to Mr. Peterson's, but nobody answered the door. It was dark and raining, and Grandma was calling for Mom again." Ellie's blue eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know what to do, so I kept walking to find help." Across town, Frank Dalton sat on his porch steps, grimacing as he massaged his right thigh. Beside him was Officer Miller, who had insisted on staying to help secure the property. "You could have explained all this from the beginning," Miller said, gesturing to Frank's leg. Frank's jaw tightened. "And say what? That I can't properly care for my family because I'm too broken? That I couldn't even catch a 6-year-old in a rainstorm?" He shook his head. "A man handles his responsibilities." "Even when it's killing him?" Miller challenged. Frank's gaze drifted to the height marks on the porch post, tracking Ellie's growth over the years. She deserves better than what we can give her, but we're all she's got. The conversation was interrupted by the rumble of approaching vehicles, a small convoy of pickup trucks stopping in front of the house. From the lead truck emerged Bill Cooper, commander of the local VFW post, accompanied by 3 other veterans. "Heard one of our own needs some assistance," Cooper called out, his voice gruff but kind. Frank stiffened, pride warring with necessity on his weathered face. At the hospital, Ellie had fallen asleep after completing her drawing. Margaret showed it to Claire in the hallway. "The third leg is a walking aid," Margaret explained quietly. "Some kind of homemade crutch or cane that broke during the storm. That's what scared her, not Frank himself, but his fall and her inability to help." Claire stared at the drawing, pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to align. So, Ellie wasn't running away from something. She was running to find help, Margaret finished, for the people she loves. Word spread quickly through Pine Creek that Frank Dalton had returned home. By mid-afternoon, the small property had become the center of a quietly divided community. On one side of the rural road, Dorothy Williams had organized a small group of concerned parents who stood with arms crossed, occasionally taking photos with their phones for documentation. On the other side, Bill Cooper and his veterans had unloaded lumber, tools, and supplies from their trucks and begun assessing the house's most urgent repair needs. "This is highly inappropriate," Dorothy declared loud enough for everyone to hear. "That man should be under investigation, not receiving community support." Bill Cooper straightened from where he'd been examining the sagging porch. "That man," he replied evenly, "is Sergeant Frank Dalton, decorated combat veteran, who's been trying to hold this family together with nobody's help. If he needed help, he should have asked someone in." Dorothy's group called out. Frank remained inside, the weight of public attention more unbearable than his physical pain. Through the window, Officer Miller could see him organizing Mildred's medications with methodical care. "He did ask," Miller said quietly to himself, remembering Claire's discovery of the rejected assistance applications. At the County Social Services office, Claire confronted her supervisor, Ronald Perkins, with the folder of denied forms. 7 applications over the past year, she said, spreading them across his desk. All from Frank Dalton, all denied or deferred for further review. Perkins barely glanced at them. "We have limited resources, Claire. His situation didn't meet urgent criteria. A disabled veteran caring for a child and an elderly woman with dementia doesn't meet urgent criteria. He never indicated the severity. Because he couldn't," Claire interrupted, her professional composure cracking. "Have you seen these forms? The medical terminology, the documentation requirements. It would challenge anyone, let alone someone who's already overwhelmed." Perkins leaned back in his chair. "I understand you're emotionally vested in this case, but this isn't about emotion," Claire countered. "It's about a family that slipped through every crack in the system we're supposed to maintain." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Dr. Abernathy reviewed Ellie's latest test results with growing concern. "The infection is responding to antibiotics," he explained to Margaret, who had remained at Ellie's side. "But I'm troubled by her overall kidney function. This isn't her first episode." "Can it be treated?" Margaret asked. "Yes, with proper ongoing care, but she'll need regular appointments with specialists. Medication, possible dietary changes." He hesitated. "In her current home situation." Margaret watched Ellie sleeping. What if there were proper support systems in place? At the sheriff's office, Officer Jackson was building his own narrative of the situation. He'd discovered that Frank had once raised his voice at the pharmacy when told Mildred's medication wasn't covered, a moment that, in Jackson's mind, revealed a volatile temperament. "We should be looking harder at Carol's disappearance," he insisted to Sheriff Reynolds. "People don't just abandon their children and elderly mothers without reason." Sheriff Reynolds considered this. "Any leads on her whereabouts?" "I found her car," Jackson replied triumphantly. Long-term parking lot at Birmingham Airport. Been there almost 2 years according to records. And look what was in the glove compartment. He placed an evidence bag. On the desk containing a one-way ticket receipt to Nashville, Tennessee. She ran, Jackson concluded. Question is, what was she running from? Back at the Dalton home, the veterans worked efficiently despite the whispers and stares from across the street. Inside, Frank finally showed Officer Miller what had been hidden from everyone. From beneath the sofa, he withdrew a crude homemade walking support, a length of sturdy wood wrapped with duct tape and fitted with a padded top where it would tuck under his arm. The VA prescribed a proper brace, Frank explained, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. But the approval got lost in paperwork. This was temporary just until... He trailed off. Miller examined the makeshift crutch, noting where it had splintered and broken. When it rains, the wood swells. Frank continued quietly. Makes creaking noises. Ellie always said it. Sounded scary. That night it finally gave way completely. And you fell, Miller finished. Frank nodded, the memory painful. Couldn't get up, couldn't reach the phone. Told Ellie to get Mr. Peterson next door. His voice cracked slightly. But I never thought she'd walk all the way to town. Alone. As dusk fell over Pine Creek, Ellie woke in her hospital room and immediately asked for her drawing pad. On a fresh page, she began to create a new picture. Her mother walking away, a suitcase in hand, while a smaller figure watched from a window. When Margaret gently asked about the drawing, Ellie's response chilled her to the bone. Mommy said we were too heavy to carry anymore. Morning brought a tentative peace to the Dalton property. The veterans had worked until sunset, repairing the leaking roof and reinforcing the sagging porch. Dorothy's group had eventually dispersed, though. Not without promises to stay vigilant. Frank emerged from the house carrying a toolbox, determined to contribute despite his limitations. As he attempted to climb the ladder Bill Cooper had left propped against the house, his right leg buckled beneath him. The toolbox crashed to the ground, tools scattering across the dirt as Frank collapsed. Officer Miller, who'd returned to check on the situation, rushed forward. I'm fine, Frank insisted, his face ashen as he struggled to rise. Just lost my balance. You're not fine, Miller said firmly, helping him to the porch bench, and there's no shame in that. For a moment, Frank's carefully maintained composure crumbled. I promised Carol I'd take care of them both, he confessed, his voice barely audible. A man keeps his promises. Even impossible ones, Miller asked gently. Frank stared at his trembling hands. She couldn't handle it. Anymore. Mildred's condition worsening, money running out, my health. He looked up, his eyes haunted. One morning she was just gone. Note on the table saying she needed a new start. That wasn't your fault, wasn't it? I came back from Afghanistan different, damaged, not the man she married. The conversation was interrupted by Miller's phone ringing. Claire Bennett with an update on Ellie. At the hospital, Dr. Abernathy confirmed what they'd feared. Ellie's kidney condition was chronic and had gone untreated far too long. Claire confronted the doctor directly. How did this slip through? The cracks? Don't children get regular checkups through school? The doctor sighed heavily. Ellie hasn't attended regular school. According to her records, she's been homeschooled due to her grandmother's care needs. And no one followed up? No one checked? Small town, limited resources, Doctor. Abernathy replied, the familiar refrain echoing Ronald Perkins' excuses. Claire thought of all the denied assistance forms in Frank's file. He tried to get her help, she realized aloud. The appointments on the kitchen calendar, the specialist referrals. Pediatric nephrology is only available in Birmingham, the doctor confirmed. Without transportation, insurance coverage, or financial means. The implications hung heavily between them as Margaret approached with news. Ellie was asking for Frank. Meanwhile, Officer Jackson had been pursuing his own investigation. He'd located the airline. Carol Dalton had flown with and confirmed she'd departed to Nashville 2 years earlier. A call to Tennessee authorities revealed a Carol Matthews, her maiden name, had obtained a driver's license 8 weeks later. She started over, Jackson told Sheriff Reynolds. New name, new life. Left everything behind, including her daughter and ailing mother, Reynolds noted, his expression troubled. That doesn't tell us anything about Frank's role, though. People don't just abandon their families without reason, Jackson insisted. Sometimes they do, Reynolds replied quietly. Sometimes the burden becomes too much to bear. At the hospital, Ellie sat up excitedly when Claire entered her room. Is Frank coming to see me? She asked, hope brightening her eyes. I drew him a new helper that won't break in the rain. Claire smiled, sitting beside the bed. He'd like that very much, but first, can we talk about your kidneys? The doctor says you've been hurting for a while. Ellie nodded solemnly. Sometimes it hurts a lot. Frank took me to the doctor, but they said we needed a different doctor. The special kind. Her brow furrowed. But it was too far away, and the car broke, and Frank's leg was really bad. Did that make you sad or scared? Sometimes, Ellie admitted. But Frank said we were soldiers together. Soldiers are brave even when they're scared. The afternoon sun bathed Pine Creek in golden light as Claire drove Frank to the hospital to visit Ellie. His reluctance to accept help was evident in every tense line of his body, but his concern for his stepdaughter outweighed his pride. The doctors say her condition is treatable, Claire explained, but she'll need ongoing care. Specialist appointments, medication, proper monitoring. Frank nodded. Silently, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. Mr. Dalton, Claire continued gently, I've reviewed all your assistance applications. You've been trying to get help for a long time. Wasn't enough, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. I should have done more. How? Without transportation, with limited income, caring for both Ellie and Mildred? Claire shook her head. The system failed you, not the other way around. For the first time, Frank turned to look at her directly. When you come back from war, they tell you to ask for help if you need it. But they don't tell you what to do when help doesn't come. At the hospital, Ellie was sitting up in bed, coloring with Margaret. When Frank appeared in the doorway, her face lit up with a smile that transformed her entirely. Frank, you came, she exclaimed, then immediately asked with concern, how's your leg? Did you get a new helper? The simple question, so innocent yet so telling, brought unexpected tears to Claire's eyes. Frank moved to Ellie's bedside, his limp more pronounced without his makeshift support. I'm all right, kiddo. More importantly, how are you feeling? Ellie launched into a detailed explanation of her treatment, speaking with the peculiar medical vocabulary of a child who had spent too much time in adult situations. The doctor says my kidneys need special medicine. And guess what? Margaret knows how to make paper cranes that actually flap their wings. As they talked, Margaret quietly joined Claire in the hallway. She's been worried about him, not herself, Margaret observed. Kept asking if he was taking his medicine and resting his leg. Claire nodded. She's been acting as a caregiver, at 6 years old. Inside the room, Frank was examining Ellie's latest drawing, a design for a new helper stick decorated with stars and stripes. This is pretty fancy, he said, his voice warm with affection. It won't break in the rain, Ellie explained seriously. I asked the doctor, and he said they make special ones that are super strong. Frank's expression softened with a complex mix of emotions. Love, regret, determination. Ellie, do you remember the night your mom left? The child nodded, suddenly solemn. She said we were too heavy. That wasn't about you, Frank said firmly. Never about you. Some burdens are too heavy for some people, but not for me. He took her small hand in his. I promised I'd take care of you, and I mean to keep that promise. Outside the hospital room, Claire's phone buzzed with a message from Officer Jackson. Found Carol, living in Nashville under maiden name. Agreed to talk. The Pine Creek Veterans Hall was an unassuming building on the edge of town, its worn flag flying proudly despite the faded paint. Inside, Bill Cooper had called an emergency meeting of local veterans. One of our own needs help, he announced to the assembled group. Not charity, respect, and practical support. Among those present was Victor Ramirez, a Vietnam veteran whose construction company had built half the homes in the county. "Tell us what's needed, Bill," he said simply. Frank Dalton served with distinction in Afghanistan, came back with wounds both visible and invisible, Bill explained. He's been caring for his stepdaughter and mother-in-law alone since his wife left. Pride kept him from asking for what he deserved. "That's a war wound too," someone murmured, "the kind they don't give medals for." Meanwhile, Claire faced her supervisor across his cluttered desk, her detailed report laying out the systematic failures in the Dalton case. "This isn't just about one family," she said firmly. "It's about every veteran, every elder, every child who falls through the cracks because paperwork is more important than people." Ronald Perkins shifted uncomfortably. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A complete review of, our assistance application process, outreach programs specifically for veterans with families, and immediate support for the Daltons." At the hospital, Margaret and Officer Miller accompanied Frank to Ellie's room for a supervised visit. Frank paused in the doorway, uncertainty briefly crossing his face. Ellie looked up from her bed, her smile brighter than the sunshine streaming through the window. "Frank, you came back." "Promised I would, didn't I?" he replied, moving to her bedside. Under Margaret's gentle guidance, Ellie explained her understanding of the third leg that had caused such confusion. "It makes scary noises at night," she explained to the adults, pointing to Frank's injured leg, "especially when it rains, and sometimes it breaks, and then Frank can't help Grandma." Frank, emotional but dignified, explained how his injury caused him chronic pain. The homemade support he'd fashioned would sometimes crack under his weight, leaving him temporarily helpless. Margaret observed that Ellie's concern was protective rather than fearful, a child worried about her guardian's pain, not afraid of him. "You're very brave, Ellie," Margaret said softly. "Both of you are." As they talked, Claire made a remarkable discovery in Ellie's school records, notes from a school nurse dating back months, expressing concern about Ellie's recurring symptoms, concerns that had been filed away and forgotten in the administrative shuffle between districts. As Ellie's condition improved, with proper treatment, her natural cheerfulness returned. The hospital staff had grown fond of the resilient little girl who thanked everyone and saved half her desserts for later, just in case. During an art session with Margaret, Ellie created a detailed picture book titled My Family, filling it with colorful scenes of home life. "This is Frank reading me stories at bedtime," she explained, pointing to a drawing of the living room. "He does funny voices even when he's super tired." She turned the page to show another scene, a small figure helping an elderly woman in a chair. "This is me. Helping Grandma remember to drink water. I put lemon in it so she likes it better." Margaret smiled. "You take very good care of your grandmother." "Frank taught me how," Ellie said matter-of-factly. "He says family helps family no matter what." The final page showed a night scene with rain and a fallen figure. "This was the scary night," Ellie explained softly. "The third leg broke and Frank couldn't get up. Grandma kept asking for Mom, and I didn't know what to do." Her small finger traced the raindrops on the page. "I tried to help, but Frank is too heavy. He told me to go next door, but Mr. Peterson didn't answer. So I kept walking to find someone." Meanwhile, Officer Jackson had made contact with Carol Matthews, formerly Dalton, in Nashville. Initially reluctant, she finally agreed to speak with Claire via video call. The woman on the screen looked both familiar and foreign to Claire, who had seen photos of Carol in the Dalton home. Her hair was differently styled, her makeup carefully applied, but her eyes carried a shadow that makeup couldn't conceal. "I know what you must think of me," Carol began defensively, "that I'm a terrible person. I'm not here to judge," Claire replied. "I'm trying to understand what happened." Carol's composure wavered. "It was overwhelming. Mom getting worse every day. Frank coming back from war different, in constant pain but refusing to complain. Then Ellie getting sick." She looked away. I just disappeared inside that house. Nobody saw us struggling. Frank did his best, Claire said. I know, Carol whispered, tears welling. That's what made it worse. His determination to handle everything, to never show weakness. I couldn't be that strong. I broke. Across town, Frank was receiving his first proper medical assessment in years. The VA doctor's expression grew increasingly troubled as he examined the extensive damage to Frank's leg. This injury should have had surgical intervention years ago, he said. The nerve damage alone. How have you been managing the pain? Frank's answer was simple. Didn't have much choice. Later in the hospital cafeteria, Officer Miller confronted his colleague. You were wrong about Frank, Jackson. We all were. I was doing my job, Jackson defended. When a child shows up with a story like that, you heard what you expected to hear, Miller interrupted. We all did. No one actually listened to what she was really saying. That evening, Ellie asked Margaret a question that struck to the heart of everything. Do you think I can go home soon? Frank needs help with his words sometimes. The papers confuse him. Margaret looked at the child, not just a victim of circumstance, but a vital member of her family unit. You really care about taking care of Frank and Grandma, don't you? Ellie nodded seriously. We take care of each other. That's what family does. The morning sunshine streamed through the county office windows as Claire presented her findings to a committee of department heads, including her supervisor and Sheriff Reynolds. Her detailed report laid bare the systematic failures that had allowed the Dalton family to slip through the cracks. In the past year alone, 7 requests for assistance were filed, and either denied or left pending. She explained, her voice steady despite her emotion. Frank Dalton approached the VA hospital, the county health department, and our office multiple times. Each time, bureaucracy created obstacles that a man in his situation simply couldn't overcome. Ronald Perkins shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The applications were incomplete. Because the forms require medical terminology and documentation that would challenge anyone without specialized knowledge, Claire countered. We're supposed to help people navigate these systems, not create more barriers. Meanwhile, at the Veterans Hall, a remarkable transformation was underway. What had begun as a small repair effort had blossomed into a full community mobilization. Victor Ramirez had organized contractors to renovate the Dalton home, making it accessible for both Frank's disability and Mildred's needs. Women from the VFW auxiliary were collecting household supplies and preparing frozen meals. It's not charity, Bill Cooper reminded everyone. It's respect for service and sacrifice. Across town, the hospital staff prepared for an important meeting. In a private consultation room, Carol Matthews sat nervously, having flown in from Nashville overnight. Across from her was Claire, with Margaret present for support. Before we discuss Ellie's future, Claire began, I'd like you to understand exactly what happened the night she came to the police station. Carol nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Ellie wasn't running away from something terrible Frank did, Claire explained gently. She was trying to find help because his homemade walking support, what she called his third leg, broke during the storm. He fell and couldn't get up. With Mildred confused and no neighbors answering their doors, Ellie did the only thing she could think of. She walked to town to find help. Carol's eyes filled with tears. I always taught her to find a police officer if she needed help, she whispered. She remembered, Margaret said softly. She did exactly what a brave, resourceful child should do. The conversation was interrupted by a knock. Officer Miller entered with Frank, who stopped short at the sight of his estranged wife. Carol, he said, his voice a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. The moment stretched between them, years of unspoken words hanging in the air. In Ellie's hospital, room preparations were underway for a surprise. The staff had arranged for Mildred to visit, carefully supervised by a nurse from Shady Pines. Though confused by the new environment, Mildred's face brightened at the sight of her granddaughter. There's my little helper, she said, reaching out with trembling hands. Ellie climbed carefully from her bed to embrace her grandmother. "I missed you, Grandma. Have you been taking your medicine?" "The nice people help me remember," Mildred replied, patting Ellie's cheek. "But they don't put lemon in my water like you do." Their reunion was interrupted by the arrival of the entire group: Claire, Margaret, Frank, Carol, and the officers. Ellie's face lit up at the sight of so many familiar faces, but her eyes widened in shock when she recognized her mother. "Mom," she whispered, disbelieving. Carol moved forward hesitantly. "Hi, sweetheart." The room fell silent as Ellie processed this unexpected appearance. Then, without warning, she ran to Frank instead, throwing her arms around his waist and burying her face against him. "It's okay," Frank murmured, stroking her hair. "Everything's going to be okay now." Ellie looked up at him, then whispered something in his ear that only he could hear. Whatever she said made Frank's eyes fill with tears, even as a smile touched his lips. Later, when Margaret gently asked what she had whispered, Ellie's answer illuminated everything. "I told him I wasn't scared of him. I was scared for him. I didn't want him to be hurt and alone like when Mom left." In the hospital hallway, Claire noticed something Frank had brought with him: the broken remains of his homemade walking support, still in his jacket pocket. When questioned, he admitted he'd kept it as a reminder of how far they'd come. Ellie spotted it during a moment alone with a nurse. Taking the splintered wood in her small hands, she explained with the simple clarity of a child, "This is the third leg. It was too big and heavy, but it was all he had. That's what I was trying to tell the police officers, but grown-ups don't always understand kid words." The nurse, realizing the significance of this statement, immediately called Claire and the officers to witness Ellie's explanation, the final piece that made the entire picture clear. The transformation of the Dalton home over the following week seemed almost miraculous to those who witnessed it. What began as basic repairs had evolved into a complete renovation. Victor Ramirez and his crew installed wheelchair ramps and widened doorways for Mildred's access. The veterans group replaced the leaking roof and repaired the heating system. Women from the church filled the pantry with food and the linen closet with fresh bedding. As Frank surveyed these changes from the porch, his expression was a complex mixture of gratitude and discomfort with being the center of such attention. "It's something else, isn't it?" Bill Cooper said, joining him. "Never expected anything like this," Frank replied quietly. "That's the problem," Bill said, his voice gentle but firm. "You shouldn't have had to expect it. It should have been there all along." At the hospital, Ellie's doctor was reviewing her discharge plans with Claire and Margaret. "Her condition is stabilized, but she'll need ongoing treatment, regular medication, quarterly visits to the specialist in Birmingham. We've arranged transportation through the county's new Veterans Family Assistance Program," Claire explained, unable to keep the pride from her voice. The program had been approved. In emergency session after her presentation, with Ronald Perkins notably silent during the vote. "And her home situation?" the doctor asked. Margaret stepped forward. "My husband and I have offered to provide temporary foster care while Frank completes his medical treatment and the house renovations are finished." The doctor nodded approvingly. "And the mother?" Claire's expression softened. "That's complicated." Indeed, Carol's return had created a wave of complex emotions for everyone involved. After her initial tearful reunion with Ellie, she had admitted to Claire that she wasn't ready to resume full maternal responsibilities. "I broke something in myself when I left," she had confessed during a private conversation. "I need to fix that before I can be any kind of mother to her." Instead, she had committed to weekly video calls with Ellie and monthly visits, a schedule that would increase as she worked with a counselor on her own healing journey. For Frank, Carol's return brought both closure and new beginnings. Their private conversation in the hospital chapel had been difficult, but necessary. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she had said, "just to understand that I couldn't bear watching everyone suffer while feeling powerless to help." "I understand powerlessness," Frank had replied simply. Now, as preparations for Ellie's discharge continued, Dorothy Williams made an unexpected appearance at the Dalton property, looking distinctly uncomfortable as she approached Frank and Bill. "I've been asked by the town council. That is, I've volunteered to coordinate meal deliveries for your family," she said stiffly, "if that would be helpful." The olive branch, though awkwardly extended, represented a significant shift in community perception. At the social services office, Claire's report had triggered a county-wide review of similar cases. She was now training a new, enthusiastic assistant on identifying families who might be silently struggling. "Look for the patterns," she explained, showing case files with multiple canceled appointments or incomplete applications. "These aren't signs of disinterest. They're red flags for families facing barriers we need to help them overcome." As the afternoon sun began to set, Margaret brought Ellie to visit her freshly renovated home before the official discharge. The little girl's eyes widened as she took in all the changes. "It's so different," she exclaimed, exploring the new wheelchair ramp with delight. Frank watched her from the doorway, leaning on a proper medical walking aid provided by the VA hospital. "What do you think, kiddo? Will it work for us?" Ellie nodded solemnly, then asked. Then, the question that had been on her mind, "When can I come home for real?" Margaret knelt beside her. "Soon, sweetheart. Frank needs to finish his treatments first, and you need to get a little stronger. But you'll visit often, and before you know it, you'll all be together again," Frank added softly. "And this time, we'll have help. Proper help." As they prepared to leave, Mildred, having a moment of complete clarity, reached for Ellie's hand. "They can see us now," she said with surprising lucidity. "We're not invisible anymore." 3 months passed, marked by gentle transitions and new beginnings. The crisp autumn that had witnessed Ellie's desperate journey gave way to winter, and then to the first tender buds of spring in Pine Creek. At the town park, Frank sat on a bench watching children play on the newly installed playground equipment. His posture had changed, back straight, shoulders relaxed, no longer bearing the weight of constant pain. The proper medical brace on his leg, nearly hidden beneath his jeans, had replaced the crude third leg that had caused so much misunderstanding. Officer Miller approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this, Ede," he said, handing one to Frank before sitting beside him. The 2 veterans shared a comfortable silence, watching Ellie laugh as she navigated the monkey bars with newfound confidence. "She looks happy," Miller observed. Frank nodded, a quiet smile touching his lips. "The doctors say her kidney function has stabilized. With proper medication and monitoring, she should have a normal childhood." Across the park, Claire was training her new assistant, pointing out community resources for the families they served. The Ellie Protocol, as it had become known in the department, had already identified 3 other veteran families needing similar intervention. At the edge of the playground, Margaret supervised as Mildred fed birds from her wheelchair. Though the elderly woman's condition continued to progress, her quality of life had improved dramatically with proper care and support. "Frank," Ellie called, waving from the top of the slide. "Watch this." As the community gathered for their annual spring picnic later that day, the transformation was evident not just in the Dalton family but in Pine Creek itself. Mr. Grady chatted with other shopkeepers about the monthly veterans discount program they'd implemented. Dorothy Williams, having experienced her own humbling education, now headed a committee dedicated to identifying isolated elderly residents. When a curious child pointed to Frank's leg brace, asking what it was, Ellie answered before anyone could intervene. "It helps him stand tall, like how people helped us when we needed it." Frank added quietly, "Sometimes people don't need judgment, they just need someone to really see them." As the afternoon waned, the small family prepared to head home. Not to a place of isolation and struggle, but to a home warmed by community and understanding. Ellie took Frank's hand on one side, and the handle of Mildred's wheelchair on the other, forming a complete circle. "Are you ready?" Frank asked. Ellie nodded, looking up at him with clear eyes no longer shadowed by worry beyond her years. "We're still standing," she said simply, echoing the phrase he had taught her during their hardest days. "Yes," Frank agreed, surveying the community that had finally learned to see the invisible. "Together, we're still standing."